Allie with Potomac Beads. Join me in creating this wrecking ball earring. It's in black to give it kind of that dark look, but you can do this in so many different colors. The real reason for it is to get a nice count on bezeling around some of the smaller Rivolis with 15O Delica beads. If you need any supplies for this, make sure to hit that link below in the description to shop with us online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. To get started on this design, we are going to be using 8mm and 12mm Rivolis. Now you may have bezeled Rivolis before. We're going to take it up a notch and use some 15O Delica beads. I'm going to be using the transparent root beer AB because they pretty much match with every color. Once you get them out of the tube, they look a little bit lighter than they do in the tube, and they just have that nice kind of deep khaki color that matches everything. So I have an 8mm as well as the 12mm Rivoli here. For the 8mm Rivoli, we are going to start out by doing 22 of our 15O Delicas on some .006 black thread with a size 12 beading needle. When we come to the size 12mm, we're going to do 34 beads. We are going to do the exact same thing for the 8mm as well as the 12mm. So I'm going to show you how to do the tinier ones. That's a little bit more difficult because it's smaller, and you're going to repeat the exact same steps for the 12mm. To begin, once again, I have 22 beads on my thread with a stop bead at the end for my 8mm Rivoli. For the 12mm, you're going to use 34. Once you get that count on your thread and needle and you make sure that that count is correct by double checking, I want you to sew back up through about 4 or 5. We just want to get our start away from the stop bead. Once you sew back through those, starting at the stop bead and going toward that long progression of beads that you have, you'll notice that that creates a little loop. I try to keep the stop bead off of that loop a little bit because it makes it easier, especially when working with these tiny beads. Coming out that bead, whichever one it may be, 6, 7, 4, 3, doesn't really matter. You're going to pick up a bead, and we're going to call the bead I'm coming out of bead number 1. We're going to add another bead, skip over bead number 2, and sew through bead number 3. If you've never done any peyote stitch before, go ahead and check out maybe even the simple Rivoli bezeled earring video, and that will help you to get the hang of how this works when doing a smaller scale like this with the 15s. So we're coming out of bead number 3. We're going to add another bead, skip over bead number 4, and always we're going to sew through the odd number through bead number 5. Once again, add a bead, skip a bead, skip number 6, sew through number 7. So we originally started out with 22 beads. As we go around putting this, what is our third row of our peyote stitch, the first 22 are actually 2 rows. When we go ahead and start this next one, I have 1, 2, 3. We're going to have a total of 11 beads added on. So I'm going to continue around the loop, adding a bead, skipping over bead number 8, sewing into bead number 9. So you're going to get this ladder look effect, or this brick wall effect. And you're going to continue the whole way around your piece, adding in your 11 new beads, going through every other bead on the original starter row as we progress and add this third row of our peyote stitch. When you're going back into bead number 1 here, so I'm adding my 11th bead, I'm sewing back into bead 1, the bead that my thread was originally coming out of as I started doing my rows. From here then, I'm going to do what's called a step up. I'm stepping up through the bead that I added first in this third row. So we added 11 beads onto our peyote stitch there, and I'm sewing through bead number 1 that I just added. I'm going to give a nice tight pull, and now I'm going to do another row of my peyote stitch. This time it's pretty easy because you can add a bead and you'll see where the beads are sticking up. So the bead sticking up right there, I'm going to sew through that bead number 2 from the third row I did, and add bead number 1 from row 4. Add another bead, sew through bead 3. So once again, we're going to add 11 beads. Adding a bead, sewing through the next one. As you add beads for this 4th row, I want you to also make sure to give a nice tight pull. That's going to make this into a band rather than flowering out. It's going to make it more into that tubular shape. So keep going around, adding in your next row of your seed beads. Here, adding in that row of 15-0 Delicas. And you want to make sure as you're adding in your third row that you're going into row 3, not back to row number 1. After this fourth row, it gets really, really easy because your peyote is very established. Sometimes if there's curving or turning, it's because by accident you've flipped the peyote stitch and you're going into row number 1 rather than row number 3. So around this circle we go. A couple more beads to add in. We're going to pull nice and tight then on our thread, not our needle. And that's going to, again, make that into that tubular peyote shape. There's bead number 10. Bead number 11 goes on. I go back into that first bead from row number 3. And then I'm also going to progress at the same time through bead number 1 from this row 4 that I just completed. Again, here's where we're going to give a nice tight pull on our thread and see how that turns it into that band rather than making it flower out. See that little kind of wheel? Now what we're going to do is switch over to some 15-0 seed beads as we go in and pull it together on top of our 8mm Rivoli. Coming out of row number 4 here, we're going to switch over to 15-0 seed beads. They're going to be slightly thinner than the 15-0 Delicas, and we're going to sew in for row number 5 a row of 15-0s. So on goes a bead, sew into the next bead that's open. So you're going to see easily those 15-0s go into progression. Once again, 15-0 goes on, over to the next one. So I'm going to continue again till I have 11 of my 15-0s in that peyote stitch row. I've also made sure to take my stop bead and move it to the front of the project because that way it's not in the middle as I'm going around and pulling tighter on this band of beads. At this point now, after finishing your 11 15-0 seed beads, I sewed through the next Delica like I'm going to continue my stitch. So I finished it off and I popped in my 8mm Rivoli into the center there. We're going to reverse our thread and come back through the rows of peyote stitch. So instead of going forward, I'm taking my needle and thread on a diagonal from row number 1 there to row number 4 to 3, 2, and 1. So that way I'm going back to the front. The reason I put my Rivoli in here is because I want to give a nice tight pull to make sure that it is nice and centered and nice and encapsulated basically in the back. It's going to kind of pop in and out as you're working with it until you tighten up this back and add a row of 15-0s along the back here as well too. So, or the front, depending on which way you're looking at it. From here, I'm coming out the front and doing the exact same thing. So we're going to add 15s all along the opposite side. And as you add these along the opposite side, you kind of want to move your beads around so that way they do end up cupping around that 8mm Rivoli. So on goes a bead, on to the next one. And pull it in towards the center of the piece. To our on, I have 9 more to go. So once you're done with your 11 beads on the front, what we are going to do is I stepped up coming out the first 15-0 that I added, and I'm going to literally sew around them because I'm using black thread with the black crystal, and I'm not adding any beads whatsoever. I'm just sewing around the entire center there. I'm going to pull those beads in toward the center, going through 2 rotations of thread around the 15-0s here, and then I'm going to flip my thread to the back, going along the peyote line, and do the exact same thing. See, it gives that nice tight pull in and grips really well. Again, 2 passes. If you are using a bead or a thread where you can see the thread, rather than like me that it's black thread and a black crystal so you can't see it, you can use a Charlotte, which is a very small check faceted 15-0 in the center there. Once you have your 2 rotations around, give a nice tight pull, go onto the back here, sewing again on that angle. You can do one at a time, or you can do through multiple beads at a time. And we're just going to go right to the back here and repeat the same thing. So I don't like to tighten up the back of and reinforce the back until I do the front. That way I have everything nice and tight, and I make sure that both sides are matching. So I'm going around here, pulling those 15 seed beads in toward the center just by sewing through all of the thread. Again, this one was a count of 22 beads in the original starter row, and then each row you add 11. When I get to my 12 millimeter, it's going to be a total of 34 beads. Done in the exact same fashion though, around the center, adding in 2 rotations of thread as well. Once you have that reinforcement here along the back and you're through all your beads, again I recommend 2 times, and then you make sure your Rivoli is not going to pop out of there. Pull it in towards the center. Take note of where your starter thread is. You're going to work back toward that because we're going to use our wire guard for our top to attach our earring to. So right here I'm going to come out of my 15 seed bead and go into my 15 Delica. That sits right behind it. When working with this peyote stitch, you always want to make sure that you hide your thread. You don't want to see a lot of thread. I'm going to go in here and go on a diagonal. I'm reversing my thread, and I'm coming out right by that starter thread because I'm going to be able to tie my knot right at the end of the wire guard. You can also make a loop with seed beads, but right here that's that perfect fit. On goes my wire guard up through the top. When I come out through the bottom here, I'm going to pinch my wire guard so that way it's nice and together and pretty easy right there to hold together. I'm going to go down through the other side of the wire guard and then pull it down onto your piece and watch where it lines up. It's going to line up right over one of the delicas that you're coming out of. You're going to skip over to the next delica in the exact same row and just have that sit nice and in the center there. I'm going to reverse the thread here at the top, go back through, reinforce this, getting another set of thread through it, and once I have that reinforced and another set of thread through, I'm going to simply move my stop bead out and tie off my 2 thread ends. Once you have the first little portion of your 8 millimeter Rivoli, and it is so cute and tiny, you can see, you're going to do again your 12 millimeter the exact same way. So we're doing the exact same stitches, the exact same way, 4 rows of our 15 Delicas, then our row of our 15s to the front, our row of our 15s to the back, and the thread goes around 2 times. Coming up to the top here, instead of adding a wire guard, we're going to make a chain for this wrecking ball to hang from. So we're going to use square stitch. I have 2 beads and I'm coming out through row number 3 of my peyote stitch. And I'm going to go back into the bead that I'm coming out of. So I'm rounding out the thread, I'm coming out the right side of the bead. I add 2 15 seed beads and I go back through that same delica that my thread was just coming out of. Those beads sit right on top then, and I'm going to go back up through bead number 1 toward bead number 2. Add another 2 beads, so down through bead number 2 now. So it almost looks like herringbone stitch, but instead of going to the outside, we're going to stay to the interior of the beads. Go back through that same 15 Delica, back out, and now up through my 2 beads on the right hand side. So bead number 1 and bead number 2. See how those sit right on top of one another? Now once again, 2 more beads get added on. So down through bead number 2. Take your thread and needle over to the right side, up through the 2 last beads. Once again, 2 beads go on, down through the left side, back up through, 2 beads on the right. the one your thread was coming out of, and the first bead that you just added in that set of 2. Now you can do this as long or as short as you want to get that wrecking ball look. I want it to hang fairly long, so I'm going to do this for a full inch for the design, and then I'll show you how we're going to attach to our top portion. So once you have about 18 rows or so, or 19 rows, I have 1 inch is what I went for. I'm going to go back up to the top piece, so my 8mm Rivoli. Draw a line basically from the top here down to the bottom, so you make sure that you're sitting nice and even and in the center. So I want to come out through the second row to match, and I'm going to go right into the center of that piece. Coming out of the top of seed beads, then I've gone into that bead, and now just like I did on the other side, the square stitch, I'm going to go down through, back through the first bead, back up through 1 row, back through the seed bead that I'm going through, back through that Delica bead, and then I'm going to knot off the piece. If you want to, you can sew your thread the whole way back down here on the left-hand side, tie off the 2 thread ends together, and then all I have to do after that is open up my ear wire, put my wire guard on. If it's too small to go on the ball like that, you can just simply slide it on the back of the ear wire here, close it up, and it's good to go. I love the movement of this, and there's so many variations that you can do, adding in further drops as you work with this wrecking ball design style. Thanks so much for joining me in creating these wrecking ball earrings. You can always do them with 11/0 Delicas too if you don't have them, and if you are doing them with 11/0s, make sure to comment below and give us your feedback for the counts of the beads. I love the fact that the crystals really take center focus with those smaller 15/0 Delica beads. Remember, if you do need any materials, go ahead and click on the description below. That way you can click through and purchase them from us here at Potomac Beads. Remember also, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything from us here at Potomac Beads, as well as give a little thumbs up. And you can always share this if you know somebody that loves Delicas or loves that wrecking ball look. As always, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully this gives you ideas to make them even longer, do more Delicas and more crystals, or even do the same pattern in a nice choker necklace. I can't wait to see everybody's pictures of them in our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making. Thanks so much for joining me, and enjoy your wrecking ball earrings.